Hi, welcome to Train Signal. We're continuing our discussion of advanced services in Windows Server 2012. We're exploring the interesting field of digital rights management or information rights management, DRM, IRM. You'll see Microsoft use all those different acronyms for this feature. Technically, the feature is Active Directory Rights Management Services, ADRMS. So we're going to see how to install it here. This lesson is going to assume that you've attended the Active Directory Rights Management Services architecture discussion. So if you haven't been through that lesson, that might be a good thing to do first. On the other hand, if you're ready to just jump in and install the thing, this is the lesson for you. The installation for ADRMS is in some ways straightforward, but there are some surprising little trips and traps that are waiting for the unwary. So we're going to walk you through each of those here to be able to show you how to be able to create a fully functioning ADRMS installation in your environment. We'll start by picking the database that we install into. RMS stores information about its configuration in either an external SQL Server database server, if you have one, or alternatively, in a local database using what Microsoft used to call SQL Server Express Edition, and they now call Windows Internal Database. Having done that, we identify a service account for ADRMS. Like a lot of applications, ADRMS is going to accomplish part of its work by using a user account. It's going to act like a user in order to create files, to manipulate things on the network, things of that sort. So we need to pick a user account, importantly not the administrator account for that computer or indeed the domain, but a standard user account will be used for that purpose. So we'll configure that. We'll then move on to where we're going to store the keys used in making ADRMS work. Those of you that attended the other lesson know that there's a lot of digital certificate manipulation that goes on behind the scenes in ADRMS. So being able to know where we're storing our keys, is it being handled by a cryptographic service provider or is it being handled internally inside of ADRMS, those are important considerations. And having done that, we can turn our attention to IIS. Microsoft uses Internet Information Services as the main connection point into ADRMS. We're using what are referred to as web services. We're exposing the ADRMS feature as essentially a web application that the ADRMS client can consume. The client can connect to IIS and access the web-driven functionality of ADRMS from that point. So being able to configure IIS properly for that purpose is an important point. And there are some interesting subtleties there. There will be an obvious opportunity for error making in the real world. So let's jump to the server environment and get that installation rolling. So here I am on server 1. The starting point, of course, is going to be to go add the component to the operating system. This is a role in the Windows Server 2012 environment. It is a feature important enough that I might dedicate a whole server to it. The developers of this software identify that it's probably best to run an ADRMS installation on a server by itself. Not so much necessarily for the performance benefits of it, but largely for security reasons. We're going to be doing a lot of work with manipulating permissions to gain access to resources. To the extent that I can have anything unrelated to that security management task on this server, I'll be happier to be able to get those things off of this server and put them somewhere else. Note that as we install ADRMS, it's also going to want .NET Framework for some programming elements it's going to use. We're going to add the tools, of course, to administer it. And very interestingly, there's IIS. Recall that IIS is going to be supplying the connection mechanism by which an ADRMS client gets connected into this environment. So I will go ahead and add those additional features that are necessary and click Next. No other features outside of that are necessary here, so I'll click Next there. Quick blurb of information about what ADRMS is and does. I'll click Next. I'm going to install just the core ADRMS functionality. In a different lesson, we'll discuss federation services. ADFS is another technology in the Active Directory family of identity management utilities, but we'll address that in a different lesson. In this case, we're not doing federation support with our ADRMS environment, at least not yet. So I'll leave that unchecked. And we're ready to install. There we go, our installation is underway. It's worth noting that I'm not going to need to install manually an ADRMS client component. RMS was introduced again way back with the Windows Server 2003 release. Really, the RMS feature was rolled out as a separate standalone product around the year 2005. So at that time, there was a separate ADRMS client to install onto a computer to allow it to play nicely with the ADRMS server. Microsoft incorporated that RMS client functionality into the client OSs, starting with Vista. So Windows Vista, Windows 7, Windows 8, plus of course all the corresponding server OSs, so 2008, 2002, Server 2012, all are ADRMS clients natively. I don't need to install additional software on the client OSs to make that work. This is taking a little while to finish. Let me go step on the train signal accelerator pedal here. Hang on a second. There it is. That's better. And there we go. We should really sell these train signal accelerator pedals. Maybe rent them. Okay. Anyway, we're ready to move forward. So let me go ahead and click the Perform Additional Configuration link. There is some cleanup work to do. Now that we've got the binaries installed, we do need to actually flesh out the process of getting the software up and running. Clicking that link brings up the ADRMS install wizard. We need to wait for the little progress bar to finish, and there we go. Let me go ahead and click Next. And that brings up our first big question. Are we rolling out a new ADRMS cluster, or are we adding another server to it? To create a new ADRMS root cluster is to say that I want to create the root server, the starting point of this ADRMS installation. I do have the option, if I've got an existing ADRMS cluster out there, to instead add an additional server to that grouping of servers, adding a licensing-only server. That server is going to be able to deploy use licenses and such to other affiliated computers in this environment. I can use that to be able to put a ADRMS presence closer to users that are maybe in a branch office or things of that sort. In this case, I am creating a new ADRMS cluster, so I'll click Next. So our next job is to identify which database server we're using. Now I can, if I have a separate SQL Server database out there, go use that and specify which database on that server I want to use. In this case, this is a simple test evaluation environment, so I'm going to go the other way and use a local copy of Windows Internal Database, also known as SQL Server Express Edition. I'll click Next, and that asks us for a service account, a user account that will be usable for the internal workings of ADRMS. It does point out here that we want a standard domain user account that has no other special permissions. So we're not looking for a domain admin here, we're not looking for any other special abilities. We just want to make sure that this is a user account that is a member of the Active Directory domain. So let me go pick a user account. I created an account specifically for this purpose called ADRMS user. That account has a password, of course. It'll confirm that credential and drop the user ID into my dialog box. With that done, I'll go ahead and click Next. And that lets us specify our cryptographic mode. Choice of a cryptographic mode is all about strength of signature hashes. What does that mean? It means that I've got a choice really of 1024-bit or 2048-bit keys to be able to secure this environment. Greater number of bits is a more secure environment. Smaller number of bits gets its mathematics done faster, but at a trade-off of some weakening of security. In general, more is better, but there is a certain point of diminishing returns there. It is possible to over-secure your environment, where you're wasting way more CPU cycles in doing your encryption and decryption than you're gaining over a simpler key that uses fewer bits. What's important is to make sure that all of our RMS servers are all at the same cryptographic level. So in this case, this is our first one, so there's no special reason not to use cryptographic mode 2. So I'll leave that selected and click Next. And we get a choice for ADRMS cluster key storage. Where do we store the key? RMS can use its own internal key store, or we might be using something called a cryptographic service provider, a CSP, and using its storage. In this case, this is a demo environment again, so I'm just going to use ADRMS. If I had chosen using CSP, I'd have to choose which CSP I'm using. And in this case, because I chose cryptographic mode 2, I've only got one CSP at my disposal. If I'd chosen cryptographic mode 1, I'd have a greater number of CSPs available here. But let me back up and choose to store things with the RMS instance and click Next. It now wants a password with which to protect the RMS cluster key. This is the master key for all the works of this particular ADRMS cluster. This password is used to protect that key. This, for obvious reasons, is a piece of information that you must not misplace. If you call Microsoft and say, hey, I lost my cluster key password, I don't know what my RMS cluster's private key is, they're going to say, well, neither do we actually. We don't store that information. They will recommend that you demolish your ADRMS installation and rebuild it. If that sounds like a lack of fun to you, make sure you have a good strategy for keeping track of critical pieces of information like this one. With the password configured, I'll go ahead and click Next. Now we begin to shift into the IIS portion of the installation, identifying which website to use on our IIS web server. In this case, there's only one, so I will choose default website. If there was more than one, I could pick and choose. I'll click Next. We get a choice of whether to encrypt the communication between the ADRMS client and the ADRMS server using SSL encrypted communication. If we do, we'll need to choose a certificate for that. If not, we don't. Note that you do need HTTPS if you're going to do federation support. If I want to be able to communicate using ADRMS across an ADFS connection to be able to go connect to some other partner company, some other organization with whom I've got a relationship, then I would need HTTPS. In this case, this is just a local demo, so I'm going to stick with the simpler to implement unencrypted connection. And we now need an FQDN, a fully qualified domain name, a name for our ADRMS server that will make a valid URL. Note that we're preparing to build http:// something or other. So this is going to be something like adrms.globomantics.local. You get to pick the virtual computer name of this. As long as it's resolvable via DNS, you're good. This is the address that we're going to hand to clients. Clients are going to go call Active Directory when they want to go do RMS work. They're going to say, hey, domain controller, I want to do the RMS thing. What's my connection point to get into the RMS environment? Active Directory is going to supply this URL, whether it be HTTP or HTTPS. That can be an A record. You can create an A record for whatever that first part is. Microsoft also has a recommendation of perhaps using a C name, an alias record in DNS instead, where ADRMS here is an alias to the actual server name of the actual computer that's hosting ADRMS. The benefit of which is that later on I can rename the server, I can migrate ADRMS off of one server onto another, and I don't need to change the client experience at all. The clients continue to connect to adrms.globomantics.local, not knowing that it's now on some different physical server. All that done, I'm going to click Next. It wants a name for the Server Licensor Certificate, SLC. Again, from the other lesson, you'll recall this is the master key that the RMS server uses to be able to encrypt and decrypt all the vital communications between itself and the other clients that make up our environment. So in this case, we're on the New York City Server 1 server for this, so it's offering me that name. I'm going to keep that, but I'm going to go ahead and prefix it with ADRMS-Globomantics, just to make sure that it's perfectly clear what I'm using that for. I'm going to even go ahead and add in -SLC, make sure everybody's aware that this is the Server Licensor Certificate. Having done that, we click Next. One last major decision, whether or not to register the SCP, the Service Connection Point. The Service Connection Point is data that lives in the configuration partition of Active Directory. By that I mean that it's not in the same area that includes your ordinary users, computers, groups, and OUs, and those sorts of things. It's a separate partition of the AD database, and one that specifically stores information about running services that are needed by the overall organization. ADRMS is quite possibly one of those. So I have the ability from here to say that I want the ADRMS install tool to go call Active Directory and store information in it that describes our new ADRMS installation. Specifically, I want to store that URL that provides a client a hook into the use of ADRMS, and I want that information to be accessible in Active Directory. To be able to make that change, you need to be the enterprise administrator, or a member of the enterprise admins group, which is to say you're the administrator account of the forest root domain, or you're some other user account that has been explicitly added to the enterprise admins group. In this case, I am logged on as administrator of the forest root domain, so I will just go ahead and register the SCP now. It is possible to do so later, but for the time being, now is a fine time. It shows me my list of decisions that I've made. I can do a quick double check to make sure that everything makes sense. Having done that, I can click Install to complete the installation of the RMS server. And there we go. That's now installed. Note that you do need to log off and log on again in order to be able to access the administration console for it, so I'll go ahead and do that. And I'm back in business. Let me go to the Tools menu. We now see that we do have an Active Directory Rights Management Services tool in the Administrative Tools menu. So let me go ahead and launch that. While that takes a moment to launch, let me go launch the tool called ADSI Edit, ADSI EDIT, ADSI Edit. Active Directory Services Interface is what ADSI is short for. ADSI is a programming environment intended to be able to enable programmatic access to Active Directory. I want to pause just a moment here to be able to point out that if I go connect to my domain controller, perusing the configuration context, that inside of it I will find a set of objects, including a set of services, one of which is a Rights Management Services node, inside of which is something called an SCP. And at first glance, you look and go, hey, there's nothing inside of it. Something's wrong. Well, actually, no, because the details that we care about are actually inside of the details of this object. If I pull open its properties, it contains a service binding information attribute that includes that interesting piece of text. HTTP adrms.globalmatics.local _WMCS/certification. And that is the URL that will be handed to clients who call Active Directory and say, hey, ADRMS, how do I do that thing? The domain controller says, here, use this information. So, that being said, let me close that up, and let's look at the RMS console itself. We can see that it has already added for us a reference to the NYC Server 1 computer on which ADRMS is installed. We've got some configuration details at our disposal, including important things like picking which service account we're using. Of course, we did that already in the installation, but we could change it if need be. We can make changes to which URL is used to be able to gain access to the environment. We can view which RMS servers are in our RMS cluster, our collection of servers that work together for this particular installation. We can see the service connection point and even remove the existing one and change it to something else. One very important configuration option that we need to put into place before we can do much with ADRMS is a setting that's not even in the RMS tool itself. It's in the IIS administration tool. So let me jump over there. And in the IIS admin utility, I'm going to go browse into my server. From my server down to sites, from sites down to the default website, inside of which is _WMCS. This is the site we just saw a moment ago, which is being used by ADRMS. If I expand it, I've got a series of portions of the website that are accessible to me here, virtual directories. I'm going to browse to the one here called licensing. That node there acts as kind of a directory of a sort. It's a collection of related elements, but I can't see them at the moment. To be able to see them, I'm going to right-click licensing and choose the option to switch to Content View. When I do, I can now see the things that lie inside of the licensing collection. And there are two particular files that we care about here. One called license.asmx, one called servicelocator.asmx. What's important is that we want to make those files easily accessible to client computers. So what we're going to do specifically on them is to enable anonymous authentication to those web pages. ASMX files are web service documents. Some of you have seen Microsoft web pages that have ASP pages or ASPX pages. ASMX is a web service. It's a little bit like an ASPX website, but there's no site there. There's no graphical interface to it. What there is instead is software. Kind of in the same way that Windows computers have connected to other Windows computers and run Windows services using proprietary Microsoft communication technologies. These files are enabling connections to a server to be able to run a program using Internet standard web communication technologies. So, what do we do with these things? Let me take license.asmx first. I'm going to right-click it, and to be able to configure it properly, I need to flip it back to the Features view, which is a little bit ironic, but there we are. We're now looking at the details of license.asmx and the various configuration details of that particular web page. And where I want to go is down here, the authentication node. A double click there brings up the authentication page, in which we can see that at the moment Anonymous authentication is disabled. We do need to fix that. We right-click that entry and enable it. And I'm going to then repeat that process for servicelocator.asmx. So I'm going to right-click licensing again, switch back to content view, go find my other file, right-click it, switch to features view on it, double-click authentication, and turn on anonymous authentication there as well. So there's our IIS configuration. IIS is now exposing a series of virtual directories, some of which include ASMX web services that we can connect to. And we're now ready to move on to the remainder of our ADRMS configuration. The last minimally necessary thing that we need to do to be able to proof test that we've got a working ADRMS environment is the creation of something called a rights policy template. When you go to secure a document using an ADRMS enabled application like the Alpha Suite, one way to do that is to apply a rights policy template to that location. So I need to create those rights policy templates, and I need to make sure that they're available to my clients when they request them. So that's a two-phased process. First of which is to create a rights policy template. It shows me here the option to manage my actual current distributed rights policy templates, or to manage the ones that are archived once I've pushed into the background because I'm no longer using them. Verifying that that's configured properly, I'm going to come over here to the right and click the link that says I want to create a distributed rights policy template. I'm going to click Add to start that process. It wants to know which language am I doing my work in. In this case, English sounds like a good choice. I need a name. Maybe corporate IT wants to be able to allow people to create documents that are read-only and are only usable for the next 7 days. So this is the read-only for 7 days policy. Interestingly, Microsoft does require you to supply some sort of description here. If you don't, it doesn't enable the Add button, and you can't complete the process of creating your policy template. I could add a list of other user rights definitions, other policies that I could make available to users. One is adequate to illustrate our point. Let me click Next. It wants to know to whom am I giving rights here, and what level of access am I giving. If I hit the Add button, I can pick and choose different individuals here, but in this case I want to let anybody in the company be potentially given the read-only permissions described by this template. So I'm going to choose the Anyone option rather than picking a particular user or group. I'm going to OK that. And what permissions do I want to give to anyone? I want to give them the ability to view this document, as opposed to the permissions to edit or save or things of that sort. I'll click Next and configure my 7-day content expiration policy here, specifying that it expires after 7 days, or I could choose a specific date and time if I chose to. And in this case, I'm going to couple that with a license expiration time of 7 days. Note that the permission to use the content is a different thing from the expiration of the certificate that I use to be able to unlock it. Those two commonly will go together, but not necessarily. There may be scenarios where I want to vary those. Other extended policy options. Do I want to allow a user with a browser to be able to access this file if they don't have a otherwise appropriate ADRMS enabled application to access that document? Do I still want to let them have access to it through a browser window? In some cases that's appropriate, other times not. Do I want to require a new use license every time a user connects to a document? If that user is going to be using that document in some remote site and the only ADRMS server is here at corporate headquarters, and I run the risk of that connection being down and the user not being able to use a document that they just got done getting a copy of, I might choose the option to leave that unchecked. But if I check it, we are disabling client-side caching. Every time a user wants to read this document, they need to check back in with the RMS server to see if it's okay. I can supply additional custom data for a specific application if it's needed. In this case, the Alpha Suite doesn't require any of that, so I'll leave that alone. Next, do I want to enable content revocation rules? Again, we'll talk about that in the lesson that focuses specifically on these templates. With that done, let me click Finish, and I've got a template. Now, how do we make it available? Well, that's actually accomplished with the link down here. Change distributed rights policy templates file location, in which I've not set a place for clients to be able to get templates. I want to let them do so, so I will click Enable Export. And I'll choose a UNC, a Universal Naming Convention path name, for a location for them to be able to export to. That's going to need to be a path that the ADRMS service has access to. Remember that we created a user account to be the service account for ADRMS. That account needs full control at whatever location I put here. So let me go ahead and create a shared folder for that purpose. I'm going to go visit my C drive. I'm going to go add a new folder called RMS Templates. I'm going to share that folder. I'm going to configure permissions on it to give full control permissions to the ADRMS user. So there's my ADRMS user account. I'm going to give that user full control. Let me double check my NTFS permissions. I can see that users get read and write. If I want ADRMS user to have full control, I'll need to be able to widen that scope a little bit. So let me add the ADRMS user here, giving him full control on this side as well. I'll click OK and close. We're ready to deploy templates to this location. So let me jump back over to my RMS console. I'm going to configure rights policy file locations, and I'm going to set it for this server, /NYC-SVR1 /RMS templates. And if all goes well, we should see that that template now appears here in the RMS templates folder. Sure enough, here's an XML document that defines what that looks like. If you've not yet mastered the skill of being able to read an XML document and get some sense of what it's doing, now's a good time because Microsoft loves XML. Alright, so now we're ready to jump to a client computer and see this policy take effect. Okay, we're over here on Windows 8 Client. We're getting ready to do some ADRMS testing. Our scenario here, Terrell Wickstrom here is the manager of the finance department at GlobalMatics, and he's been tasked to put together the annual report that's going to go to the shareholders. That has to go from him to Emily Parrish, who's in corporate management. She's going to be relaying it to the people at the meeting. So it's up to Terrell to be able to get this document to her, but needs to do so securely, of course, because the Federal Trade Commission would surely get grumpy if we took some sensitive document and left it in the hands of people who are going to trade on that information and profit unfairly, things of that sort. So Terrell's going to use his copy of Microsoft Word here and has in his My Documents folder the annual report. Okay, document looks good. It's ready to go. I don't want to just email it because, again, I run the risk of sharing information in a way that I don't want to do. So what's my next best option? Well, we're going to protect it with ADRMS. So the obvious right thing to do is to go to the File menu, to the Info area up top here. And there's an area here labeled Protect Document. Lots of ways to protect a document, only a few of which have anything to do with ADRMS. I can mark a document as read-only. I can encrypt it with a local password. Only someone with the password can get in. But those things aren't ADRMS. Those are features that go back to early versions of Microsoft Word. The one that's relevant to our work here is this guy, Restrict Access. Grant people access while removing their ability to edit, copy, print, whatever is determined by our templates. And there's an option here to connect to DRM servers, that's effectively ADRMS, and get templates. Now I'm going to click this in just a second and it's going to complain at us. It's going to give us the perhaps least helpful error message in all of ADRMS functionality. Ready? Here it comes. Sorry, something went wrong opening Information Rights Management protected content. The operation being requested was not performed because the user has not been authenticated. The user's been what? The user just logged into Windows. They're perfectly authenticated as near as we can tell. Authenticated to what? This error message shows up in a couple of circumstances. The first one, somewhat surprisingly, is a scenario where you're logged on as a user who has no email address in the details of his or her Active Directory user account. It's a tad bit surprising, but it's true. If Active Directory doesn't know what your email address is, ADRMS can't help you. RMS keys a lot of what it does to which email address is tied to your user account in the Active Directory database itself. Doesn't matter if you've got an Exchange account, doesn't matter what other sort of email system you're using. If Active Directory doesn't specifically name your email address in its details of your account, you're dead in the water. So in this case, the problem is not the email address. The problem is actually one that I can solve with the help of, remarkably enough, Internet Explorer. Now, why IE? Remember that a lot of what RMS does to get its work done is done through web services functionality at the IIS server. In order for that to work, there needs to be some degree of healthy communication between the client and the web server to get certain things done. And some of those techniques are techniques that we have, over a period of time, become suspicious of when internet-based web servers try to pull them on us. Very, very useful, very meaningful business functionality, but things that have been exploited by the bad guys enough that IE has pulled back and said, ooh, we probably shouldn't let just any web server do these kinds of things to your client machine. But in this case, this is functionality that we do want to allow to happen because this is an internal server. In short, it's in our local intranet, and we want to treat it as such. So I'm going to name the website, the FQDN, for the ADRMS server here in the list of websites that are intranet servers from our perspective. So I'm going to add adrms.globalmantics.local to that list of local intranet servers. Now that I've done that, let me jump back to Microsoft Word. Let's try to protect the document again. Let's see if we get the same error message. I'm going to connect to the DRM servers and get templates, and it looks like nothing happens. This surprising little bit of behavior, I wish there was some sort of prompt that said, hey, that worked. I would hope further that it would tell you to go back to the Protect Document menu, come on back down to Restrict Access, and hey, look, there's our GlobalMantics read-only 7 days policy. Same policy template that we put together earlier. We made it available through the shared folder. Our client machine learned about that information from the ADRMS server, retrieved the templates, made them available. So I can now say that I want to restrict this document in such a way that maybe makes it restricted so that only certain somebodies are able to access it. I'm going to restrict the ability to read this document to Emily Parrish. She's emily.parrish at globalmantics.local. I could give her alternatively the ability to make changes to it. I can configure other details of what exactly I want to allow her to do and not do. I do want to let her to print that content because she needs to put it in the hands of the shareholders at the company meeting. But in any event, I want the document to expire after a couple of weeks. Let me OK that change. And access to that document has now been restricted. Terrell's going to drop back and save his changes. And for demonstration purposes, I'm going to have him take that very sensitive document, copied out of his My Documents folder, and I'm going to put it in Public Documents. Now, that's a folder that anybody logged onto this computer would be able to access. That should include, for example, Emily Parrish, who we do want to let read this, and, for example, Melanie Brady, who's another employee in the organization who should not have access to it. Let me log on as both of those individuals and verify the behavior that we're looking for here. Okay, we're logging in as Emily Parrish. So there we go, we're logged in as Emily Parrish. Let me jump to the desktop, and I'm going to have Emily go visit the Public Documents location, which again contains documents that are visible to every user of this computer. She's going to double-click the annual report. See the message that says configuring your computer for information rights management? Yep. So Emily's going to try to validate herself here to ensure that she's able to get access to this content. And she succeeds. There's that document that only she and Terrell should have any ability to access. Let me log off as Emily and log in as Melanie Brady, and let's see what happens in that circumstance. And we're logging in as Melanie. Okay, we're logged in as Melanie Brady. Let me go ahead and jump to the desktop for her. We're going to go to Windows Explorer. Melanie, you'll recall, is not in the list of people who are authorized to access this document. We go to the Documents library, down into Public Documents, double-clicks the annual report, prepares to configure the computer for rights management. Melanie is melanie.brady at GlobalMantics. And it says, sorry, you need permission. Would you like to request permission from Terrell? Terrell can get an email from her that says, hey, I'm looking for some assistance. Can you help me get into this document? Terrell's going to say no, not until the meeting on Wednesday. So we've successfully been able to mark a document as being available to certain users but denied to certain others. We've been able to get the ability going for someone to request permission if they think they should have access to some content. And I can do this throughout my GlobalMantix organization with a fairly straightforward sort of a process, assuming of course that I watch out for these couple of major landmines in the installation process. So it's my hope that by watching this, you'll be better prepared to watch out for those same trips and traps in your environment as you get ready to roll out ADRMS. And we've got more about this topic coming in other lessons.